Welcoming everybody, Rabbi Sai, for an opportunity to learn on Memorial Day. Shem Shemayim, and we have the opportunity to hear from a Talmud Chacham who is involved in a cutting-edge shaila which can affect all of us. It's a kavod gadol to be able to hear from David Cohen Shlita on the fish controversy. What are the facts? That's like around with all of us.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. And I see the cover of the topic. They started to not serve bagels and lox. People are all safe and give us danishes. Okay. What I'm going to speak about is going to be divided into two parts. And the first part is going to be, if I can describe it as such, the Gemara says that there's such a thing as learning to be Meshamash Hamidei Chachamim. Being Meshamash Hamidei Chachamim means that sometimes, many times in learning, we find different things that seem to be questions or opposites of each other or something that's not clear. And a person needs to learn from his Rebbe how to answer that question. What do I do when I'm faced with two things that don't seem to work together? And to the people here who have learned Gemara, you're familiar with that. You open up a Tosfos, and Tosfos says, the Gemara here says this way, and I have another Gemara that seems to say not like that. How do I understand these two things? And being Meshamash Hamidei Chachamim means to understand. So what do I do now? Now that I'm stuck with this question, how's the right way to answer that kind of a question? So the first part of what we're going to talk about is going to be exactly something like that, which is as follows. The Torah tells us that we're not allowed to eat bugs, worms. For the rest of today, we're going to use the word worms to describe what we're talking about, because in fact, that's what the Shiloh is about. The Torah says you're not allowed to eat worms. But most people are surprised to hear that not every single worm is usher. To us, to the average person on the street, you say to them, you don't want to eat bugs. They say, of course, all bugs and worms, you don't want to eat any of those things. But in fact, that's not exactly true. And the Gemara says the following. In order for a bug to be usher, if it's a water-based bug, that bug has to have moved around in the water first for it to become usher. And for a land-based bug, it has the same thing. The bug is not usher unless it's walked on the ground first. That's an example of that. Some of you may have heard that a year or so ago there was a whole to-do about whether raisins have bugs in them. Okay? And the reason why the raisins do have bugs in them, but the reason why you're allowed to eat those raisins is because it's a Taz who brings down that, and it's very true scientifically also, that the bugs that come into the raisins after they're off the tree. So, and the bug moves into the raisin. It spends its whole life inside that one raisin, and therefore the bug never walked on the ground. It spent its life in a raisin, and therefore that bug is not usher. If you happen to be, it disgusts you to eat it, then you shouldn't eat it. You're probably not allowed to if it disgusts you. But from the din, the fact that it never walked on the ground means that it's not usher. So in the water, the Gemara says that the same thing applies in the water, that if it never swam around in the water, it's not usher. And therefore the Gemara says the following rule. If you have a worm that's in the intestines of a fish, that worm is usher because it's possible that worm was floating around in the water, was swallowed by the fish, and now you finally get inside his intestines, so you say, okay, that worm swam around in the water, that's an usher worm, now that worm is inside the fish, so that worm is still usher. But the Gemara says, what happens if the worm is not in the intestines, but the worm is in the flesh of the fish? Then we assume the worm never was outside. The worm spent its entire life inside that fish. It grew inside that fish, and that worm is mutter. Because that worm, it's just as much of a worm as the other worm is, but this worm never swam outside. And to explain to you what I mean is the worm that we're talking about, what they call the Anisaki's worm that we're talking about, it's quite a long worm. It's maybe 2 inches, an inch, 2 inches long. It's a nice sized worm. You wouldn't notice it in your fish because it curls itself up into a little. You wouldn't notice it. Just looks like a discoloration in the fish. But when you pull it out, it's this big. It's nice and curly. It's not very appetizing once you see it. So the thing is like this. So that's what the Gemara says. That's what the Shulchan Aruch brings down. There are some Rishonim who don't read the Gemara this way, but just about everybody does. It's put down in Shulchan Aruch. If you have a worm inside of the flesh of your fish, it's mutter. No one argues on that. No one argues on that. That's the Psak Halacha. The question is that science nowadays believes, science has believed for many years, that the worms that are in the flesh of the fish don't grow inside the flesh. The Gemara says they come from inside the flesh. Science believes there are some that may actually some worms may lay their eggs in the fish, and the whole worm grows his whole life in the egg. But most of the worms, and we're focusing now on this one, the Anisaki's worm, most worms don't do that. They are laid out in the ocean. In the ocean they hatch into little worms, where they get swallowed by the little fish, and as proverbially, the little fish gets eaten by the big fish, and the big fish gets eaten by the even bigger fish, and eventually it makes its way into the fish that we eat, a piece of cod. The cod will eat the fish that's a little bit smaller, and the worm will be inside it. So, how can we say that the worm is mutter when it's in the flesh? Because it grew there, because its whole life has been inside of a flesh, and it never swam around outside, when science tells us that it's not true. We look around, and in the second part, we'll talk about some of the, not only the scientific evidence, some of the things that people themselves, average people have seen themselves, that seems to indicate that it comes from the intestines and moves into the flesh. Well, that doesn't make sense. If in the intestines it's usher, how did it become mutter if it gets into the flesh? If it goes from the intestines into the flesh? That's our dilemma. That's our question we have to deal with. And that's what we're going to try. We're going to try to answer that question. Depending on how you answer that question, these worms are either going to be mutter or they're going to be usher. Okay? We're going to see we'll say there are going to be 5 answers to this question. Excuse me. According to the first 3 answers, the worms are going to be usher. And according to the last 2 answers, the worms are going to be mutter. So in this talking about these answers, we're going to present you the different sides of each of those, what's the strengths and weaknesses of those answers, and then we'll see why. Now, I am going to, in disclosure, going to tell you that I work for the CRC. The CRC and many other hashgachos hold that the worms are mutter. So you're unfortunately going to be hearing a biased view of this. I'm going to present to you both sides, but you're going to hear a biased view of what's going on. But we're going to present the different sides of the argument as to which of these answers is right. Okay, so we have our first answer. I'm going to say it only, so you shouldn't think that this is the correct answer. This is not a correct answer. And we'll come back to this answer way further down. And the first answer is, when Chazal made their statements, when the Gemara says statements about certain dinim that are based on science or based on practical information, so there are people who have said, well, the Chachamim went to the local scientist and they asked him what to do. Much like Rabbi Cohen, if he had a shayla about something electrical, he wanted to know a question about could you use a video camera on Shabbos. So he would say, well, I have to first talk to someone who knows about electronics, someone who understands what's going on before I can decide on the shayla. So there are people who say what they do is, the Chazal asked the people out in the scientists in those days believed in something called spontaneous generation, that things can come from nothing, living items can grow from nothing, and guess what? It's been disproven. It's not true. There's no such thing. So Chazal based it on that kind of science. The science is not true, so the din is not true also. Okay, so I say this answer because this is nobody, no legitimate posek would ever say such an answer like this. I might make a mistake. Anybody sitting in this room might base some din that they said based on science. We may be completely making a mistake. We're willing to take that. We don't say such things about Chazal. Chazal got their things, when it says that din in the Gemara is coming, halach l'mashum Sinai, they have kabbalas about the din. They didn't make it up based on what Jose told them next door. And therefore, we don't say about Chazal that, they got the science wrong. They didn't know what they were talking about exactly. We don't talk like that about what it says, something in the Gemara says a din based on a piece of mitzvahs. We don't say that. There are people who would say that, but it's not, nobody mainstream would say, okay, they didn't know what they're talking about. They blew it. Okay, so I'm mentioning this answer. We're going to come back to it later, but we mention this as like not even a real answer. So, okay, now we're going to say 2 legitimate answers to why. What are we supposed to do? The Gemara says the worms from the flesh are mutter because they come from inside, and the science tells us that it doesn't. They come from the outside. Okay, first thing is, one answer is, when Chazal told us that the worms come from the inside, they weren't talking about anisakis. They were talking about some other worm. As I mentioned to you, there are worms out there. There are parasites out there that lay their eggs in the fish. They lay these tiny eggs inside the fish, and the worm, the parasite, spends his whole life inside of that fish. That's what Chazal was talking about. When Chazal said that you're allowed to eat the worms in the flesh, so there are people who say they were only talking about that one. They were talking about that specific one. But other ones that are parasites of this Anisaki's parasite that comes from the outside, that's not what they were talking about. Okay? In which case,
From the outside means as an egg or as a worm?
as a worm, coming as a worm from the outside, it's laid as an egg. The parasite in its final stage, which is in a bigger fish than we eat, like a whale or a walrus, a bigger fish, a bigger sea creature, it lays its egg in that, it gives off eggs in that bigger fish, in that bigger host, we call it. It gets excreted from the body. The egg hatches into a worm out in the water. That's where it hatches. And then it gets swallowed by the first fish. It gets swallowed as a worm. We're going to come back to that later. So what stage is life when it's in the water? So he says when Chazal said that it's a worm that grows in the fish, it's a worm that grows in the fish, they're talking about a very specific one. But the one that we're talking about, our Anisaki's, no, that's not what they were talking about. And therefore, this one is also. Okay? Now, the reason to disagree with this is because, firstly, if you ask there's a big word, parasitologist, okay? This is a whole study because there are parasites in all fish. The people who study this, they think that the rule, most worms are like this. Most worms are like the Anisaki's, that they grow, come from the outside and grow in the flesh and then grow in the intestines and make their way into the flesh. So this is not, Anisaki's is not an exception. Anisaki's is the rule. The exception is the other one, which leads us to the other point, which is, the Din Shulchan Aruch doesn't say you're allowed to eat this specific worm that's growing in the flesh. It says all worms that grow in the flesh are mutter. If the Din is only referring to a very specific worm, how come no one's telling us that? How could it be that the Din means you're allowed to eat worms in flesh? There's only one very specific one, and no one tells that. And my Shulchan Aruch doesn't say that. If I open my Shulchan Aruch, it says the worms in the flesh are mutter. Last week, I and Rabbi Fisher.
You use two different terms. You use the worms in the flesh and the worms that grow in the flesh.
Yes.
What is the lashon of Shulchan Aruch?
The Shulchan Aruch doesn't.
Aminta or
I don't remember offhand the word. I don't remember the words. I went last week with Rabbi Fishbane to a demonstration to show people where the worms are in the fish. Okay, it was held in Brooklyn by a big expert to show people where the worms are. We must have looked at 100 pieces of fish. More than that. The fish just kept on coming out. They looked at all kinds of fish, and there were worms all over the place. Okay? But I want to tell you something. I don't think maybe there was one worm that they found that they thought was mutter. They found dozens of worms that are these Anisaki's worms. They were all over the place. So think about this. The Shulchan Aruch says, if you find a worm in your fish, in the flesh of the fish, you can eat it. That's what it says. So I don't remember the exact one. It says, if you find the worms in the flesh, you can eat it. And now we looked at 100 pieces of fish, and we found 50 worms. And the Shulchan Aruch didn't eat any one of those. He only meant the one that was mutter. It's hard to believe. It's hard to accept that when the Shulchan Aruch says, and everybody since then says, you could eat the worms that are in the flesh, they only meant one very specific one. But this one, the 50, they're all over the place. That's not what they had in mind. They didn't mean that. They meant something else. So that leads us right to the next answer, what we'll call the third answer, which is, people say, it's true that nowadays the Anisaki's worms are all over the place, but it didn't used to be like that. The Anisaki's used to be not so common. The Anisaki's used to be other worms that were more common, and there's some research that shows that there's lots more Anisaki's nowadays than there used to be. They're all over the place, and therefore today the fish are all full of these Anisaki's worms. But were you to have looked 500 years ago, in the days of the Shulchan Aruch, what he would have seen was all the other worms. He would have seen the worms that are mutter, and ours would have been the exception. And therefore, when he said this, then it was true. Now the tables have turned, and now there's only usher worms in the flesh, and therefore now it's usher.
Because all those worms are coming from the intestines.
Because they're coming from the intestines. The ones that we're seeing nowadays come from the intestines into the flesh. Had the Shulchan Aruch been around in our days, the Mechaber would have said, "Oh, these are all usher." He was looking at what they were used to.
They would have said they're all mutter.
They would have said that all. If he would have seen what we see nowadays, they're saying he would have said they're all usher. And they have all kinds of reasons to explain.
How can you tell by looking at the worm that it went from the intestine into the flesh? How do you know that?
Okay, I'll get to that in the second part. We'll talk about that in the second part. I'm, for now, saying it from the scientific side. Okay, that's how the scientists believe it is. Okay, we'll talk about some of the things that people reasonably think that in the second part. So, and there are all kinds of reasons given as to why nowadays the worms are different. It ranges from different ways of fishing and different ways of gutting fish and global warming and pollutants, and they have a whole slew of reasons as to why there's more of this why nowadays there's more of this fish than the other fish. And whichever, Nishana Hateva, yeah, we have worms do different things, they have all kinds of answers, okay? So, and whichever answer you're going to say, the point is, Chazal were matter what they had in front of them, we have a different tzius in front of us, and therefore, for us it's awesome. Okay, now, the difficulty with this is that there isn't very strong science, and we'll talk about this more in the second part, there isn't very strong science to indicate that anything is different today than it was 100 or 500 years ago. The scientists believe it's always been like that. Okay? They don't see any big changes between then and now. And usually, when we want to say, when someone mentions it, we want to say Shtan HaTeva, we want to say something dramatically changed, we need to have a serious riot that something changed. As an example, there's a din that if a baby is born in the 7th or the 9th month of pregnancy, that baby can live and will be a healthy baby. But the din is, if the baby is born in the 8th month of pregnancy, that baby is so for sure not going to live that the baby's muktzah. You can't even touch it on Shabbos. Okay, now, that's a din brought in Shulchan Aruch, but guess what? Nowadays, everybody says, of course that's not true. Nowadays, it happens all the time. My twins were born in the 8th month. They're fine and healthy. They're 12th graders. They're fine and healthy kids. So that is to say, when we see a dramatic change in the teva, we say, so the person say, the teva's changed. It used to be that babies born in the 8th month were not healthy. They couldn't live. And we see that it's true.
That's what everybody says. That's not the way. But the Torah says that the 8th month baby is meant at the moment of conception. The babies are going to be born in the 8th month versus a baby at the moment of conception, which is going to be a 7th-month baby. A baby born in the 8th month is, I forgot the term of those babies, who are born that don't live from the moment of conception. But that a baby could be a preemie is a baby that really could go full term.
So you're saying the Din Shulchan Aruch, when it says a baby born in the 8th month is muktzah, meant if you know that this is a baby.
Right, which those babies are very real.
I would find it's hard to accept that because honestly, you're standing there, the baby's sitting in your house, okay? It's a nice, Yiddish mama had a baby, and she's sitting there. The Shulchan Aruch says if it's born in the 8th month, it's muktzah. So she's supposed to know, this is that kind of baby.
It's the same way the 7-month babies. You don't have any 7-month babies anymore either.
We do. What does that mean?
A 7-month baby was a baby that came full term in the middle of the 7th month. We don't have such thing. Nobody has a full-term baby. It's a preemie. Moshe Rabbeinu was not a preemie. Moshe Rabbeinu was a full-term baby, just born up to 6 days and 1 month.
Okay.
Exactly.
Now, I was about to say the same thing. Okay. So
the third side, the medical knowledge has changed the din of the 8th-month baby.
I'm not talking
medicine has changed.
I'm not talking about babies. You're saying is that there are babies, if we put them into the incubator, they could live longer. I'm not talking about that kind. I'm talking about just plain old babies that never saw an incubator and that live nice, healthy lives without anything. Right. But we medically don't see any difference in the Gemara holds 7th month can live, 8th month is worse, and the 9th month that we don't. Okay, fine. So according to this answer, if you're going to say this answer that things have changed, it basically is going to it should come out that all worms are going to be usher. Because if we're going to follow science on this, all worms are going to be usher. None of the Machmirim want to say this because it's something strange about this. You're saying is that in the days of Shulchan Aruch, those worms, certain worms were very prominent and ours didn't exist at all. And nowadays the tables have turned completely. And nowadays the forbidden worms are there all over the place and not to have mutter ones. Okay, so now we're going to pause here for a second and say like this. We've heard two answers as to how the worms could be usher. Okay? Both of those answers have a derech to them. Both of them have something that doesn't run so smoothly, doesn't fit so well into what we want, what we would guess would be right. But the reason why someone would say this answer is because of the question. We have a question. Remember, we're back to a question. We have to give some answer to this question. How could the din say that they come from inside the flesh, that they grow there, they've spent their whole life in the flesh, when it's not the Matthias. It's not what true. The truth is it's coming from the outside. So, because we're stuck, we have to give an answer. So some people hold that these two answers are correct. One of these answers, either that Shulchan Aruch only meant a specific worm, or a variation of that is that he might have meant every worm that he had, but worms are different now. There's a different way that they present themselves. So now we switch to two other answers that are going to tell us why the worms might be mutter.
Using these two answers, why it's When did they change? Last week, or did it change 100 years ago?
So they don't know. That's part of the
Some
weakness.
people only woke up today.
That's part of the weakness of the answer is that you're saying something changed without any way of no evidence or no reason to think that something happened. Do you want to say because it's overfishing, so they'll blame it on a specific year, or when people started fishing more. So whatever. But they say, who cares? I don't have to know when it changed, and I don't know what happened to my zingi. But right now, it's in front of me. I see a fish, a worm that's usher. So what can I say? It must have changed. What can I do? The din says this. I see this. So something must have changed. When it happened, who knows?
Did they say anything about lice?
Why don't we hear him out first?
Okay.
Did they say
We're getting to
anything
that.
about lice? Did they say anything about lice?
We're getting to that. Wait a second. Yes, wait 1 second. Okay. Next answer. In order to explain the next answer, we're going to say exactly what David mentioned, which is like this. The Gemara says, Hayreg kina b'Shabbos is patur. Okay, if a person kills a kina, a lice, the din is, if you kill it on Shabbos, there's nothing wrong with that. You're allowed to do it. Why? Because on Shabbos, you're not allowed to kill a living being, but you're only not allowed to kill a living being who comes from a mother and a father. If you have a living being that comes not from a mother and a father, then there's no issue to kill it on Shabbos. Okay? What the reason why you're allowed to is not relevant to us. But that's the din. So that's what the din is. You're allowed to kill a kina on Shabbos, a lice. So until 150 years ago, everybody understood that to mean that lice come by themselves. They what we call spontaneously generate. They come from themselves, like maggots come from garbage, and lice come also from sweat. They just appear out of no place, and that was considered that was science in those days. Science that these come from nothing. They don't come from a mother and a father, and therefore you're allowed to kill it. And everybody was happy with it. There were no questions. Came along 150 years ago, Louis Pasteur proved that there's no such thing as spontaneous generation. It doesn't exist. And since then, the accepted science has been that nothing comes from itself. Living things don't come from no place. Magnets don't come out of garbage. That's not true. They come from flies that lay eggs that turn into magnets. However they understand the process of what happens. So what happened to the din? Here we have a din that says that if someone kills a louse on Shabbos, they didn't do anything wrong. So what happened to it? I don't sin. How can that be? Doesn't make any sense. So now, before I tell you what the answer is, I'll tell you what the answer is not. Nobody said that we have different lice than we used to have. And nobody said, oh, the lice have started reproducing differently than they used to. Those weren't possible answers. They say, our lice must be different than those lice. In other words, they didn't say the other two answers that we said. That's not what people said. They had a different understanding. And I'm going to tell you an answer, but it's going to be instructive. The point is not for the detail of the answer. The answer is that this is for a very famous thing from Rav Dessler. He says the following. The Torah was given to human beings. The Torah was given to us to do the dinim as we see things. That is to say, there are some times that the din tells us to assume something even though the truth is not that way. What I mean is as follows. The lice, when they lay their eggs, the eggs are microscopic. That is to say, human beings don't see those eggs. Human beings, when me and you would look at it, don't see anything. To our appearance, our understanding, the lice, all of a sudden one day there was nothing, and then the next day there was a louse over there. It came from no place. If I see a cat give birth, I see the mother cat and the baby cat. When I see a louse hatch, it appears to come out of no place. So even if the truth might be that it comes from a mother and a father louse, that doesn't make a difference. What's important is, what is the human perception? The human perception is that it comes from no place. If something appears to come from no place, then the din is, it came from no place. Okay? As an example, Rabbi Heinemann spoke about this. He gave the following example. There are 3 tshuvas in Igros Moshe about very similar shilos, printed one after another. And the tshuvas are about, if I remember correctly, were about a microphone, a hearing aid, and a telephone. And the questions were using them on Shabbos and being yotze mitzvahs heard over there. In other words, if I make Havdalah and you're 10 miles away, hearing my Havdalah over the phone, are you yotze? And in these 3 tshuvas, Ramesh appears to say opposite dinim. For some of them he says it's like you did it. Some of them it's not like you did it. So what's going on? It's like 3 tshuvas in a row. What's going on? How come sometimes it's like my voice and sometimes it's not like my voice? So Bahayim explained like this. He said, when I speak into a telephone, the sound that you hear is the same sound that I made. And the same thing with the hearing aid. He says, but a microphone, the sound that I make, you hear it much louder than I said it. So even though electrically, mechanically, they all work the same, but to the person looking from the outside, if you take someone from deep Africa who never saw a microphone in his life and you bring them here, he would say is, the telephone is dragging my voice from here to there, but it's really my voice. And the hearing aid is taking my voice and putting it into your ear. The microphone is making a new voice. The microphone appears to be making new because I'm always speaking this high and you're hearing it this high. So the perception is that one is my voice and one is not my voice, and therefore the din follows the perception. The din is based on what it appears to the layperson, not what the deep technicalities of what's really going on. And therefore, when the Gemara says that the lice comes from no place,
Does the Moshe say this?
no, he doesn't. No, Rabbi Hanan doesn't say this. Rabbi Hanan, a Talmud is saying that's what he. No, Rabbi doesn't say that. No, Rabbi says the scientists are not clear what it is, and therefore I'm saying that this is your voice and this is not your voice. That's what he says. Rabbi Hanan says, I don't say, but how can you put three truths? One time you say it's his voice, one time you say it's not his voice. How can you say that? So he says, because Moshe didn't, so to speak, care what the truth was. And I know that sounds funny. You don't care what the truth is. Because for this situation, the truth is not what counts. It's the perceived truth that's what counts. That's what the din wants us to look at. So over here, the lice is considered to have come from no place, and therefore it's not considered to have had a father and mother. Now, I'm saying this, I said to be instructive. The point is like this. We had a question. The Gemara says the lice comes without parents. It has no parents. And the science tells us that they did have parents. So what did Poskim do when they saw that question? What they did was, they said is, we must have misunderstood the Gemara. When the Gemara said it didn't have parents, they didn't say is, oh, we have new lice. They said is, we didn't understand the Gemara correctly. When the Gemara says it doesn't have a father and a mother, it didn't mean that it doesn't really have a father and mother. It meant is, it doesn't have a perceived father and mother. So what we did was, when we had this question, we re-understood the Gemara. We didn't say there are new lice. We said is, we didn't read the Gemara correctly. Our simple reading of the Gemara was that it doesn't have parents. Well, that doesn't make sense. We now know that it does have parents. So we said, we didn't understand the Gemara correctly. What the Gemara meant to say was, it doesn't have perceived parents. Okay, I'm not trying to convince you of the answer. I'm trying to show you as a way of answering a kasha is to say is, maybe I misunderstood originally. Okay, so, and the same kind of thing is used to answer about the worms and the fish, which is to say, people give answers. I'll give you some of them in a second, but people say is, the Gemara uses words that say, minei kokavli. The worms come from, they grow from inside the fish. Simply that means is, they're spontaneously generated. Now that we know that that can't be true, we'll re-understand the Gemara to mean different things. If the Gemara's explanation meant something else, then the worms are going to stay mutter. Okay, so for example, one of the answers given is, this is what Rabbi Cohen was mentioning, was hinting at, is, one of the answers is that when I told you that this worm, it lays its eggs, and they hatch in the water, and then from the water they get swallowed by a little fish, the worms get swallowed by a little fish, and then a bigger fish, well, I didn't tell you the whole story. Okay, when those worms are hatched in the water, okay, the size of the worm is, and this is just hold cup for a second, okay, the length of the worm is the same as the width of between 2 and 4 pieces of hair. Okay, if you put 2 pieces of hair next to each other, side by side, the width of those 2 pieces of hair next to each other, that's how long the worm is. Okay, and how wide is the worm? It's the width of 1/7 of a piece of hair. And to make it even more is, the worm is clear. Okay, it has a drop of an off-white color to it. Okay, so imagine this tiny speck floating around in the water. That tiny speck, which is being called a worm, a larvae of a worm, okay, is so amazingly tiny, and it's clear that there's no way that a person could see that in the water. Nobody ever scooped up a cup of water and said, I have 4 Anisakis worms floating around in here. Maybe a scientist did it with a microscope, but no person ever looked into was swimming in the swimming pool and noticed, look at those Anisakis floating around. It doesn't happen like that. They're so tiny, it's not possible to see them. So one explanation for the Gemara is that since very similar to what was said about the lice, since the worms when they're in the water are not visible, to the naked eye no one can see them, so when they when they start to grow to size that they are visible, they've done that inside the fish. They never had a life outside the fish because their life outside the fish was not in anything that's perceptible to human beings. Scientists have studied it and watched and see where the eggs hatch from and this and that. They have figured this out, that it goes from a whale into this little tiny shrimp. But most of us would never see that. None of us would ever see that. Even the scientists themselves would never see that. Okay? So one answer is, Minei Kagavli means is that not that it actually grows from in the fish, but its full life of visible life is inside the fish. A variation of that is that these fish, these worms that we're talking about, are not the worms you see, walking around in your yard. Okay, these are parasites. Parasites. Most fish have parasites in them. Parasite means is that it doesn't have its own independent living. It doesn't live on its own. It only can live when it's attached to some other host. Okay, it lives off the host. So the others who say is, what the Gemara means, Minei Kagavli means to say is, any animal, any worm that doesn't have independent life, but its life is always part of something else, it lives off of somebody else, its whole life is spent inside of a host, it doesn't have its own independent status. We don't say, oh, this is a worm and worms are usher. We say, today this is a cod. And tomorrow, if he moves into a whale, then he's a whale. He doesn't have, it's like saying, we don't judge is the liver of a fish, is that liver a cod or is it a tray fish? No, we say it's part of the fish. It doesn't have we don't look at it independently. We say it's part of something else. These worms also are considered part of the fish. And there are other answers along these lines. Really, and some people say is, I don't even know what the answer is. It doesn't bother me. The Gemara says something, Minei Kagavli. I don't understand what the Gemara means now because scientists is telling me not like that. So there must be another shot in the Gemara. Okay? And they would rather say this dochik because this dochik is maintaining the din. The din says the worms are mutter, and so I say, the Gemara when the explanation is not the simple explanation. There's a more complicated explanation, in which case the din stays as is.
Does it have a life of its own underwater, though? I'm not sure I understood that. Does it have a life?
Does it have a life? Okay, so what it is that it has a.
Because if it did, then it wasn't just.
It has a temporary life after the egg hatches until it makes its way into its first host. It doesn't have any meaningful life by itself. It's always
I'm not saying that. No, that's it.
So if we have a worm in the intestines of the fish, we say that worm had its own life. It was floating around the world by itself, and one day it got swallowed by another fish. So then it got swallowed. It had its own independent life. This one has, at a very early, what they call larval stage, at a very early non-functional stage, it was floating around the water, but all of its functional life was inside of another fish. It doesn't move along until it gets another fish. Okay, so what I laugh on this, look what I'm trying to say. Sorry, I'm not telling you that every one of these answers is the easiest answer to say. You also have a hard time saying it doesn't fit so smoothly into the words Minei Kagavli. It doesn't read as smoothly into the words. I'll say it again, is that each of the answers that we're going to talk about today has difficulty in what we're trying to say. And the question we're trying to do is, we have a shaila here, we have a question. The din says this. The Matthias that we see tells us not like that. What are we going to push? Are we going to say the din stays the way it is and will be masked to something else? Or are we saying, no, the Matthias says that comes from the outside and will be masked to the other one? Okay? The last answer, the answer that I just told you is favored by lots of Litvish poskim. Okay? That's their kind of answer. The next thing I'm going to tell you is a more Hasidic approach. Okay? If I can racially profile people. Okay? And which is like this. Their answer, it's not terribly different, but their answer is as follows. Their answer is, the Gemara says that the worm grows from inside. Science tells you that the worm comes through the stomach, and this whole life cycle, there's a new word, life cycle, goes through the whole thing, and it bores its way into the flesh. And it says, scientists have made mistakes before. You think I'm going to throw out a thing because the scientists told me that? Why don't you the scientists say? It's in your head. So the scientist thinks like that. That's why. What do I have? Does that bother me? I don't care. The din said it's a fair din. There isn't any question about the din. The din is that the worm's growing in the flesh of mutter. Science says, who cares? Doesn't bother me. No skin off my back. Science says not like that. That's a different approach. Okay, it's not radically different than the one beforehand. It says I don't have to explain the Gemara. You have to tell me. They just sent out something from the an earlier Kloisenberg Rebbe, who had, when this shiloh, you should just know, did not come up now. This shiloh comes up every 10 years. So there's, the Rebbe said, he says, this you tell me? You bring these scientists. He said, they translated to me all the things that the scientists said. They read me the whole report. He said, the first week I told my wife, don't make any fish. There's bugs in them. But then they said, do me a favor, translate me the whole report, what the scientists said. Translate to me in Yiddish and Hebrew. I don't know what they translated to. He looked, he said, all things fall off the courses. He says, the Gemara says that they come from the outside, from the inside. What are you making me crazy? He said, I don't want to hear from this thing. Okay? That's it. So lots of Chassidus places will say like that. And I'm telling you, it's not really so different from what the literature place was saying. They're just saying is that I accept the signs, and I'll find a way to work that into the Gemara. And these places...
The problem is that the halacha also gives us that distinction between fish that's caught on the outside versus caught on the inside. So that the halacha itself is letting you know that fish that's caught on the outside is a problem.
That's correct, yes.
And so the halacha itself is lending its problem towards the scientific evidence that this came from the outside. So then that's the problem.
That's true.
Not
But
just that's the halacha.
but it's as clear as anything.
The halacha itself is addressing this.
That's true. That there is such a thing as a worm that comes from the outside. There is such a worm that comes from the outside. But the din is clear as day that if it's in the flesh, don't worry about that. Don't be concerned that maybe it came from the outside. Don't say maybe the worm that's in my flesh came from the outside. Not my problem. I can assume that came from the inside. So I'm allowed to assume that. Well, so what happened? I might have come from the inside. Chazal tell me not to worry about that. Either because I know why they tell me that, or because I don't know why. It doesn't make a difference. I just ignore that. Okay. So I'm going to move now. So we've now seen these 5 different answers, okay, and we're going to between these 5 answers, 2 of them said that the worms would be asur, and 2 of them said that the worms would be mutter. Okay. Now, Baruch Hashem, I asked Rabbi Cohen said he's going to come here because he's going to help us afterwards understand why we should favor one, or what we should do in this situation when what happens like this. Most of the American hashgachas, some even non-American hashgachas, and all of the bigger experts, halachic bug experts, think that these worms are mutter. At the same time, a number of very prominent poskim as well have said that these worms and the fish are asur. Okay, so what are we supposed to do in that situation? Here, I think that the mutter. I'm not the only one who thinks that it's mutter. The experts, the people who are experts in halachas having to do with bugs here and in England and in Eretz Yisrael think that it's mutter. Yet, very prominent poskim have said that it's asur. So what am I supposed to do in that situation? What should I do when I'm faced with that kind of situation? When I work for the CRC, I had long discussions with Rabbi Schwartz. Rabbi Schwartz said that it's mutter. So I guess for professionally, it's easy for me. Rabbi Schwartz said he's the boss. He said it's mutter. I have no problem. What am I supposed to do at home? Okay, what am I supposed to do? Or if he's my rabbi, I spoke to Rabbi first. He says it's mutter. So I'd say Rabbi first said that it's mutter. So if you're a person who asks Yishai Rabbi first, so should you just say first said it's mutter? Okay with me. Or do you say, wait a second, all these important poskim say that's asur. So that's why Rabbi Cohen said he's going to stay. Not so much he wants to hear what I have to say, but he's going to, when anyone has those kind of questions, that's for him. Okay, it's a serious halacha and hashkafa question. And Rabbi Cohen, Baruch Hashem. Okay. Now, we're going to go on to speak now about some of the evidence or proofs that people have brought to say that they know that the fish move across, or that things have changed, they migrate, or that things have changed. And before we start that, I want to just give 3 introductions, 3, so to speak, ground rules that we have before we start that discussion. One is, the Shulchan Aruch says, the working assumption is, worms in the flesh are mutter. If you want to say to me that the worms are, you want to prove to me that they're asur, you have to prove to me that they're asur. I'm coming with the assumption, I'm coming with a firm basis to tell me that they're mutter. You have to prove to me that it's asur. I don't have to prove that they're mutter. You have to prove that they're asur. Second is, a number of poskim who have talked about the shaila have said, well, worms are asur mitaraisa. A worm that's asur is asur mitaraisa. But I don't know how many lavim you could ever, quite a lot if you eat it. Therefore, to suffolk deraisa, you have to be machber. That's true. However, if you have this is not a fish din. If you have a piece of a vegetable, and that vegetable, more than half the times that vegetable has bugs in it, mid deraisa, you have to get the bugs out. Midaraisa, you're mechuyev to clean the bugs out, or else you can't eat it. You have to assume there's bugs in it. If less than half of the vegetables have bugs in them, then midaraisa, you could just eat it as is. Midrabanan, Chacham said, what are you doing over here? 30% of the time it has a bug in it. You have to clean it out or check for bugs before you eat the food. But that's a drabanan. So one of the vadim, not in this area, but in a different area, said, they decided as follows. This worm is a serious shaila. Is it mutter or is it asur? So when we have a fish that's infested to the point that more than half of them have the worms, which some fish do, they're going to be machmir. When less than half do, and it's only the shaila for drabanan, they're going to be mekel. So in considering this, you have to keep this in mind, that not always is it a shaila for deraisa. Sometimes it's a deraisa. Sometimes the worm, which is us with deraisa, is for me only a shaila for drabanan.
No, it's drabanan because of bittul.
It's not drabanan because of bittul, because for two sides. That one is because you could easily remove it. Okay, if you want
If you cook it, you get a fish, a sardine in a can, you can take it out.
So I'm not saying every specific case. I'm not saying it's every specific case, but in most cases you can easily pull it out. You would notice it and you could get it out. Okay? If I spent 5 minutes with you, you would be able to find it and you could pull it out. And they're not small and they're not invisible. They're nice sized. You can pull them out. And also, those rules of bittul apply when we have a vada isur that got mixed into something. Then we have rules of bittul. The rules of bittul aren't set up for cases when I maybe have an isur. Maybe have an isur, we follow roiv. With the rest we follow roiv. But the Rabbanan would say if it's matzah, then I have to look out for it. It's a different set of rules than the rules of what's batal b'shishim. It's not a rule bit b'shishim in this case. Bit b'shishim is after you know this isur.
And so even if there's more than half, I'm just saying, it's drabanan.
That's true. Also, burial is another reason why it's in that. That's a drabanan rules. Yes. Okay. And lastly is that there's something called the scientific method, and when we think about the evidence that we're listening to, we have to make sure that the evidence we're hearing is not someone's observation, but rather is scientific. I'll give you an example of what that means. If we have 10 people who have the flu, and to each of those 10 people, we tell them that every day they should drink 4 cups of Pepsi. Okay? And at the end of 2 weeks, we look at these 10 people, and we see that, lo and behold, all 10 people got better. So I say, that proves that drinking Pepsi makes you better from the flu. Pepsi is a cure for the flu, because I had 10 people, I gave them each 4 cups of Pepsi, and at the end of 2 weeks, they were all better. So that proves that Pepsi makes people better from the flu. Okay, of course, that's silly, because that didn't prove anything. Maybe they would have gotten better without Pepsi. So I have to have 10 other people who I don't give Pepsi to. Maybe Pepsi makes it worse. Maybe this guy was taking cough medicine and this guy was not taking. I have to control the situation before I can prove that Pepsi makes people. Maybe it does. I have no idea. But just by giving it to 10 people wouldn't prove anything. The scientific method would say is I have to do controls and I have to do groups that don't get the treatment. I have to do other things to make sure what I'm seeing is not maybe dependent on something else. So we'll see how that's relevant to what we're talking about. Okay. The people who want to prove that it's usher have 3 reasons to say that 3 proofs, that the fish, that the worms migrate from the stomach into the flesh. The first one is that the fish that grow in the wild, that swim around in the wild, have these worms in them, and the ones that are farm raised do not have them. What that means to say is, you may or may not know that some fish, instead of being grown out in the ocean, instead of living in the ocean and then fishermen going to find them, the fishermen grow them in their own pit in the swimming pool. Okay, and then they're right there in the swimming pool. They want them when they're ready to harvest. When they're grown to a big enough size, they just take them out of the pool. Okay, so they keep them in their backyard. They don't have to go out and find them in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They grow them themselves in their own controlled environment. That's called a farmed fish. So farmed fish, by and large, don't have these worms in them. So they say, you see, that proves that the worms are coming from whales, and the whales give off the eggs and it goes into the little fish and then into the bigger fish and to the bigger fish, because out in the wild, all those things exist. In the swimming pool in my backyard, there aren't any of those things, and therefore there's no worms. So that proves that the worms are coming from the outside. If you take away the outside, take away those other life forms that don't need to be there, then they don't exist. That proves that the worms come from the outside. So the reason to say not like that, I don't have a scientific reason like that, is that there are lots of things that go different in farm fish than wild fish. That is to say, not everything that may be the reason, well, that may not be the reason. For example, do you know that canned salmon, this I've learned recently, canned salmon is always made from wild salmon. If I buy a piece of salmon in the store, I'm going to get farmed salmon, because that's cheaper. Canned salmon is always made from wild salmon. Why? Why do they pay more to make it? The reason it has something to do with that the flesh of wild salmon is harder and it works better on a can than farmed salmon. The farmed salmon flesh comes out it's not as strong or not as tough or not as whatever, and therefore it doesn't work well for making canned salmon. Okay, now, would me and you have guessed that? Do I know the reason for that? No. Obviously, the living conditions in a swimming pool are not the same as living conditions out in the Pacific Ocean, and therefore, for whatever reason, the controlled environment lends itself towards one thing over a different thing. So that, without knowing more about it, that doesn't prove that they come necessarily from the outside.
Even if it comes from the outside, if, like you said, it doesn't have an independent existence, it's irrelevant.
That's correct. Even if we were to prove that, we'll get to that in a second thing. Right, even if were we to say that it came from the outside, this is a proof that they say that it comes from the outside. We're going to talk about 3 proofs that it comes from the outside. Coming from the outside might not mean anything. That might not be the end of the day just because you prove from the outside. I'm not saying that proves it, but that just, okay, next it, they say is.
Are you trying to say that it's neuromine and it comes from outside with that proof? Is that
No, they're not. No, they're not saying it's neurally and I shouldn't say that. There are those who have said that the worms are neurally in the water. Okay? I don't. I have to say, there's 2 arguments about being in the water. Some say that it's neurally I don't know what they're talking about. It's not something I can understand. How you can imagine that thing is neurally it's hard. I don't get it. The others say it doesn't make a difference if it's neurally. They say the thing is, if it's neurally later, it doesn't make a difference if it's neurally earlier. Now I can imagine such a shita. I can imagine the shita. I don't. The person who we know don't agree with that. They say you have to look at things at each stage, whether it's nearly 9 then. What do I care that it's nearly 9 now? And you think now it's nearly 9, but it has to swim in the water. When it swam in the water, it wasn't nearly 9. So why do I care that it swam in the water when it was not? How do I even know that happened? Me and you could never tell that. We have to use magnification to figure out that it swam in the water. There's no way to realize. No person could see that. Okay, so that's a shita that some people hold that we don't get. We don't understand that shita. But we don't agree with the shita. Don't understand. Okay.
Is that the fact that they're trying to show that they can control with the farm fish, it's different than the wild fish? Are they trying to say that's a way that we could perceive, like an argument with this perception argument?
No, because there's nothing perceptible about it. That's just a guess. We're saying it doesn't come in the farm fish. So I'm guessing that the reason is because they come from the outside. I'm not saying
scientifically. Why do we need to show that from this experiment?
Because they're trying to say is we don't want to trust science. We're trying to say is science. Point like this. You're saying to them the science is not like they did. They say no, we don't want to say the science is not like they did. I say not like they did. I could see it myself. If it's just to the science, I'm sort of putting Chazal against the scientists, then I know that the Chazal are going to win. So I'd rather say it's me who can see it. Another proof.
Shulchan is probably not dealing with only the farm fish.
He never had farm fish. No, but they're using that as a proof. They're using farm fish as a proof. The farm fish proves that it comes from the outside. Say because
We have a question and answer for you. Maybe I'm sure you have extra.
okay, we'll continue. Fine, we're getting there. The next proof is the location of these worms. And what I mean by that is as follows: a fish, the flesh on the top of the fish, like the first top, like 2/3 of the fish, is thick, and then on the bottom, the part of the flesh that covers the fish's stomach, the fish's intestines, is a thinner piece of flesh. It's called a belly flap. That's what it's called. Okay, it's the bottom, and it's a piece of thinner flesh that covers the belly, the underside of the fish. And what they find is that these worms congregate in the belly flap, and they're almost never found in the other parts of the flesh. Okay? That's it, which gives the impression that they're coming from the stomach. The intestines are right there. Excuse me. The fact that the worms are always in the belly flap and not in the other parts of the flesh implies if they would just be appearing out of no place, then they would appear out of no place every place. Why are they only in the belly flap? It must be that they're coming from the intestines and they're boring their way through into the belly flap. Okay, now, of course, like we said with the farm fish, there may be other reasons. I don't know. I'm not a worm, and I don't know why you would want to live in this place versus that place. But we don't know what's. Maybe it's more hospitable to them. Okay, but let's put that outside. Listen to what we're saying. The Anisaki's worm finds itself in the intestines and in the belly flap. And therefore, that proves that this worm is usher. Now we turn to them and say, okay, well, what about other worms? What about other worms besides Anisakis worms? Do they do the same thing? Or they also found the belly flaps? No idea. They have no idea. You know why they have no idea? Because there's a reason why they know so much about the Anisakis worms. It's not because they have stock invested in them, which they do also. That's not the reason. It's because these worms have found their way into humans. People who have eaten raw fish and other kinds of foods have gotten infected with these worms. And it's dangerous for humans. It's not dangerous for fish. It's dangerous for humans to be infected by this parasite. So there's been a lot of scientific research on this worm because it's become a health hazard for humans. And there hasn't been much research on the other ones because they're just a parasite, so to speak. Who cares what they do? So listen to what we're saying here. We're saying that this worm is different than all other worms. Chazal meant certain worms. This one, they didn't mean this one. Well, how can you say that without knowing everything about the other worms also? How can you say this one is different? I say this one is different because it's only found in the belly flap. But what about the other ones? What about the other worms? Are they also only found in the belly flap? How can you prove to me that this worm is different when you haven't researched the other worms? You don't know anything about the other worms. They say, I don't have to know about the other worms. How can you say that this worm is different when you don't know whether the other worm does the same thing? Because guess what? If all the worms are only found in the belly flap, then you can't say it proves that they come from inside because then they're all usher. And then the Shulchan Aruch is left out in the cold. Right? Then you have no answer to explain the Shulchan Aruch. If you want to be able to say mine is different, and therefore the Shulchan Aruch didn't mean this case, you have to look at both sides of the picture. And lastly about this is that you'd be surprised to hear that one of the early Achronim, called the Hagoy Shari Dura, says, what happens when you find a worm that's moving in between the intestines and the flesh? What do you do with that worm? Is the worm mutter or is it usher? In the intestines it's mutter, and in the flesh it's usher. So what do you think? What do you do about that worm?
The intestines.
The intestines is usher. Did I say opposite? I'm sorry. It's usher, and the flesh is mutter. Because what do you do with that worm? So the Gershar says it's mutter. The worm is mutter. He says because it's probably coming from the flesh into the intestines. In other words, he was looking at a fish that had worms in the intestines and the flesh, and what he said, exactly what we're describing. Because guess what? The worms have been doing the same thing since Sheshus Mibrachus. And what did he say the din is? The din is that it's mutter. So you're telling me the fact that they're near each other proves that they're usher? Well, the Hagoy Sharadur didn't think that. Okay. Last proof that they bring is, you may have heard this, there are tunnels. Okay? There are tunnels in between the intestines and the flesh. And those tunnels are the size of a worm. So that's the way the worms, that proves that the worms move from the intestines into the flesh. Okay. Now, these tunnels are, the only one who's ever seen these tunnels are rabbis. Okay. These tunnels, no, I'm not kidding. There isn't science on these tunnels. So no one really knows how common these tunnels are, or how often they are. What I'm saying is that the rabbis who have seen them, and they'll show them to the other rabbis. I don't need to put down the rabbis. You know, these are my friends. I don't need to put them down. I mean is that it's not something that has science on it as to how often do they happen. Maybe they happen only, I don't know, maybe once in every 1,000 fish that they have them. We don't know how often they are. And one thing we do know is that the tunnels, if me and you looked at the fish, we wouldn't see the tunnels. Okay? The tunnels, you can only see them with ultraviolet light. Okay? If you looked at these tunnels, you're not going to pick up these tunnels. So the din probably doesn't really care about tunnels that people can't see. As we talked about before, things that can't be perceived don't really count. And also, two more things, is that Shevet HaLevi Rav Foster is probably the most prominent person who has said that the worms are usher and written a tshuva about them. Okay? One of the few people who has actually written a tshuva to explain why he thinks it's usher. He says, everyone agrees that there are worms that go from the intestines into the flesh. Even those who say that even the din is that the worms in the flesh are usher, there are some worms that come from the intestines. Okay. Everyone agrees that the worms in the flesh are mutter, even though some come in from the intestines. How can that be? He says because it's such a rarity, it happens so infrequently that the din doesn't concern itself with the fact that it sometimes goes across. He uses that to explain a machlokes. It's not important to us. But he says is, even those who say that it's mutter in the flesh agree that sometimes it comes in from the intestines. And that's okay. Some come in the intestines, and those will be usher. You don't have to worry about that. It's so rare that you don't have to worry about that. So you're going to show me a tunnel, you're going to show me a proof that it does happen that a worm comes from the intestines into the flesh. So what? The Shevet Levi, the Oyster says that's acceptable if once in a while it happens. It's only usher if you show that it happens all the time. I mean, if it's common to happen like that, then it would be usher. So he says, according to what it's telling me that it happens all the time, therefore it's usher. That it should happen sometimes, that doesn't bother me. That's understood that it could happen sometimes and it wouldn't make it usher. Okay? And lastly, of course, is our Hagoy Sharidura that I mentioned to you before, and that said that fish passing, the worms passing between the two sides is still mutter. Okay. One more. Yeah, we're almost done. The people who want to say that the worms are usher also say that there have been two different changes have gone on since the days of the Shulchan Aruch. Again, they have to say that they want to say there's a change in order to explain why the Shulchan Aruch would say that, and the Gemara would say that it's mutter, and we would say that it's usher. One is, there are studies that show that there's more Anisakis worms nowadays than there used to be. So they want to say is, considerably more Anisakis than there used to be. So they want to say is, that maybe in the days of Shulchan Aruch, it was so rare to have one of these worms, so he could say, with clear conscience that all worms and fish are mutter. But nowadays that we have more of them, nowadays that we have so many of these kind, now we have to say they're usher. Okay, now, as I mentioned to you before, the reason why science is focusing on this Anisakis worm is because of a health concern, because it has started to infect people. The studies don't say that there's more Anisakis and less of something else. They're only focusing on this specific worm to say is, be more concerned about the health because there's more and more of them than there used to be. There's more and more of all kinds of worms. There's more and more of all kinds of insects and worms all over the place. So the studies don't prove that don't justify the claim. The claim is there's more of this and there's less of that. There's no studies that prove that. The studies say is there's more Anisakis. It doesn't say there's less of the other one. We have no reason to think that the ratio of Anisakis to other things is different today than it used to be. I told you, when we looked at 100 pieces of fish, and there were Anisakis all over the place, and none or almost none of the ones that they think are mutter. We don't have any reason to think that ratio was different today than it was 1,000 years ago. Okay, now, I'm going to say this just to... You wrote this at the beginning. You're supposed to say a joke. The Rebbe is supposed to start off a little lightly when he gives a shir to help people keep them awake. So we're doing the opposite. We do it at the end. Okay, which is, there's someone who, I say it just for the humor of it, which is, one of the people who said it's usher wrote that the Anisakis worm didn't even exist in the time of Shulchan Aruch, because the first reference you find to this worm is in late 1700s. You first start to talk about it in scientific literature. The Shulchan Aruch was written about 200 years before that, so the worm didn't even exist in the time of Shulchan Aruch. Okay?
Being arrived in scientific literature.
No, it's worse. It's worse than that. So what the silliness of this is that when Adam Rishon saw animals, so he gave names. I shouldn't say that. Adam Rishon gave names to the animals, but things like worms and even animals didn't have scientific names to them. In the 1700s, people were classifying and organizing life on this planet and giving scientific names and families and genuses and all kinds of things, organizing the names of things. And in 1767, a guy named Carl Linnaeus gave the name to this worm. And he called it Anisakis simplex. That he gave the name of it and put it into a certain category, however they organized plant life. So the reason why the name Anisakis doesn't appear before 1767 is because it didn't have that name until then. That's when somebody got up one day and said, okay, let's give him a name. So they gave him a name as of that day. So of course, he wasn't called that name before that. It's not in literature because, of course it existed. It's been around since Adam Rishon, but it just didn't exist because it didn't have that name until then. Okay, so now, lastly we're going to say is, we'll talk about evisceration. Evisceration is when you take a fish out of the water, the insides of the fish are not desirable, and you clean them all out. The process is called evisceration. You gut out the inside of the fish. Nowadays, the claim is that nowadays they eviscerate fish differently than they used to. It used to be you caught a fish at the pond, you caught the fish, you right away cleaned out all the insides, and then you ate it basically right away. You had no refrigeration, no freezer, so you ate it right away. Nowadays, when they catch fish on a boat, they catch the fish and they keep it refrigerated for a couple of days. And they may not get around to eviscerate it for a couple of days, maybe on the boat, or maybe when it gets back to land, because they're able to refrigerate fish and keep them for longer. Therefore, that gives a chance, and the anisakis they claim is don't penetrate the flesh when the fish is alive. So now that it's in the fridge, the fish died, the dead, now the anisakis has a chance to penetrate it, which my Zaidi didn't have that, because they had got out the fish right away. Okay. And in fact, they did a test. This is a one-time test, but they did it like this. They were in a rabbis, mashkichim, were in a place, and they were checking for worms and fish, and they went through thousands of fish and didn't find one worm. Okay, so obviously something was good about this batch. They weren't finding any worms in this. They took 10 of the fish from that batch, put them out on the table, and left them there overnight. When they came back in the morning, there were worms in the flesh. Okay, 9 out of the 10 had worms in the flesh. They said, you see that the worms didn't penetrate when the fish was alive, and they did penetrate if the fish died. So that proves to you that the fish migrate into the flesh when they're not alive. So that's another example of that's a variation of what we're saying. The science say that it has to do with the way we eviscerate. Is to see when we didn't eviscerate, they moved into the flesh. So now, what's difficult about this is that we need to be more scientific about how we look at this kind of a test. If I leave fish out on the counter and leave it out overnight, it does all kinds of things that wouldn't happen if it's being refrigerated. In this test that they did, they haven't even printed what they did in the test, but let alone to really see, is that what happened? Is it only because the fish was left to sit out that it moved into it? And most of the fish, most of the worms that are found in the flesh or many of them are encased already. That is to say, there's proofs that they've moved in when the fish was alive. They're trying to answer by saying that the worms moved in if they died, and there's not necessarily can they prove that. And lastly is, there's a Gemara that gives the impression that they didn't used to eviscerate fish the way we think that they did. And the fish would sit for a couple of days before they eviscerated. So again, saying to us that the change is not as dramatic as they're making it. The change is really what they're doing nowadays is very similar to what they used to do. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize if I can for you. We start off with a question. We have the worms in fish appear to be doing, or the science tells us that they appear to be doing things that the din would say it's usher, yet the din tells us that it's mutter. The din tells us that the worms in the flesh are mutter, and the science and the other evidence seems to tell us that the worms in the flesh are usher. And there's been a debate, that's what we're here to talk about. There's been this debate as to how to approach that question. Depending on how you answer that question will depend on, some people will therefore say the worms are usher. Others will say because of that the fish are mutter. And we now turn for Rabbi Cohen, who's going to tell us now what we should do. Now that we've heard, some people say that it should be mutter. Some people say that because of that it should be usher. So we hear different sides. And we hear good and bad about each side. Each side has reasons to think that it might be this way and that way. So I thank you for listening to me. If you have questions, or we wait for Rabbi Cohen to say his piece.
First, the other question. So this is Rabbi Cohen.
Rav Osner Rasha is still one who's matter the areas? With the same Rav Osner?
So it's a good question. Someone said to me, if Rav Osner didn't get it right about the worms in the fish, then maybe I shouldn't carry outside either. I'm not sure it's connected. Say. No. The father is also matter.
Person from the next one is one who wrote the Shuvah on fish.
So the son is one of
He wrote the Shuvah on the air also.
Rabbi Cohen, could you just give Rabbi Kelly for
The question that he said?
Yeah.
Well, his question was that in West Rogers Park, when the area was built, they brought certain shilas about the area to Rav Osner, the same Rav Osner that I mentioned, and they said to him, should we build an area, should we not build an area? And he wrote a tshuva saying, yes, it's okay to build the area. So if we disagree with Rav Osner about whether the worms in the fish are usher, are we therefore not entitled to listen to him when he says that you're allowed to carry an area? Okay? They don't seem to be related. Go ahead. Okay.
Scientists say they know something. Sometimes it's because they've seen it in order to less in direct way, like watching something happen under a microscope. Other times, they decide this because of a long series of deductions, because they see that, therefore this and this. In a general sense, where are they with knowing what the life cycle of this worm is?
That's a good question. The question was, when the scientist describes us the life cycle of this worm and what it does, is that based on direct observation, or is there conjecture, and they're trying to put pieces together until they've come with that decision? My impression is that it leans towards the second. There are certain parts that they can see and they can actually, detect, but a certain amount of it, it's not. No, you can't sort of tag an anisakis and watch its life as it makes its way, from one fish to another. I have a feeling that it leans towards a, so to speak, conjecture, but that doesn't mean to say that it's not good science. But it does mean to say is, what's important about the question is that we come in with an assumption that the worms in the flesh are mutter because they grow there. They come in with an assumption that spontaneous generation doesn't exist. So we're starting from two different sides. If we heard the evidence, we might come to a different decision because we're coming in from different. We're coming in saying the Gemara says we take it as a fact. The Gemara says if it's in the flesh, it's mutter because it grows from in there. Now we'll try to fit our mitzvahs into that, so to speak, into the fact. They're coming from a different angle, and they may have therefore reached different conclusions. Right? So there are those who have argued, like you said, that there's a limit to how much we can trust science because they're coming with a different set of assumptions. That's there's something to say. Yes.
What major kashrut field that's usher?
Which major hashgachas feel that it's usher? Okay. Here in the United States, the major hashgachas that I know of think that it's a mutter. Okay. With an exception is the star K, Rabbi Heinemann. Rabbi Heinemann says, this is basically what he said. I'm saying in short. It doesn't make a difference whether I think it's mutter or usher. Important poskim in Eretz Yisrael have said that it's usher. The public expects us to live up to that standard, and therefore, star K products will live up to that standard. Okay? That is to say, that's not saying I think that it's usher. It's saying is that you, the consumer, or some consumers are expecting us to live up to that standard, and therefore we will. The other hashgachos, I know the CRC and the OU and the Chav K think that hold that it's mutter. For some people find it interesting, the Eid HaCharetis also thinks that it's mutter. But others... Yes, I have to explain to you that what's going on here is that there's two different ways of saying something. There are some people, I hope no one gets insulted. Some people are machmirim, and some people are mekilim. That's one division of people. You're the machmir and you're the mekel. Then there's another way of dividing people in this kind of way, which is saying some people are traditionalist, and some people are more open-minded. Okay? Traditionalist as in, I like to do things the way we always did it, don't change anything, and open-minded is like, I'm willing to hear that maybe something is different. Usually, machmirim and traditionalists go together. Usually we put those two people in groups together. Over here, it's the opposite. Here, the traditionalists are saying, the Shulchan Aruch says that it's mutter, what are you bothering me? It says that it's mutter in Shulchan Aruch. I'm the traditionalist that says, I'm following what it said. But here, that's end up being the kula. Okay? So, the Ada is the traditionalist. They think we do it the way we always did it. We don't want to change it, and that's where that's sort of coming from.
And it would seem, not to be cynical, but it would sound like there are machmirim out there that when science will lend to chumras, they will say, look at the mitzias, look at science. And when science might lend to kulas, they're going to say, but this is not what we have in our mitzvah.
So as I mentioned, there are those who say that it's a question and it's a suffix of a deraisa. That's what some have said, is that I'm not convinced that it's usher, but since it's a question of a deraisa, I'll be machmer. Now, that has a limit to how far it goes, but yeah, that's true. There's nothing wrong with saying that when I'm not sure if it's a question of a deraisa, I'm going to be machmer about that. That's,
After you cook some fish, is it possible to see the worm?
after you cook the fish, I never tried it, but I don't see the reason why not. What I mean is that...
How come I never saw the fish? I've eaten the...
You would see it in a raw fish either. You wouldn't see it in a raw fish either because it tends to curl itself up or puts itself together. To you, it looks like a discoloration. As soon as you pull it out, it looks like, you ever see the noodles in traditional soup? It's all long curly noodles. That's what it looks like. It's pretty obvious once you pull it out that it's a worm. But when you look at it inside, it just looks like a discoloration. I mean, fish has lots of discoloration, so it doesn't strike you, So, yeah.
Since you said that all fish are eviscerated, can one assume then if a worm is found in fish that it was from the flesh rather than from the intestines?
But we only see the flesh. when we walk into the fish store, we only see the flesh. So the question is, did it start aside from the flesh, or did it somehow make it there before they got the intestines out? Before they eviscerated it, it was warm. Ran away and got into the.
We're saying that this worm is dangerous for people. Why would Chazal say it's not?
It's dangerous if you eat it when it's alive. If you cook your fish, like most sane people do, so if you cook your fish, then you won't have a problem. It's only become a problem more recently when people decided that they would eat fish without cooking it. That's what it was. I have to tell you something. I was at a group, a gathering of Rabbanim, and it was a 2-day gathering. And the night in between those 2 days, they served sushi. So the one of the rabbis who spoke on the second day says the Gemara says, I don't know which Gemara he's talking about. The Gemara says that you don't make a bracha if you eat raw fish because it's not even edible. He says, how could it be that we're sitting here at a group of rabbis and they served us raw fish? It bothered him. That was his. Yes, go ahead.
My question is just not really about the halacha, but it's about where these fish are located. Where these parasites are located. Are they, only Pacific fish, Atlantic fish, Mediterranean fish, ground fish like cod, Atlantic salmon?
They tend to be in saltwater fish because in order for their life cycle requires bigger fish that are saltwater based. They're not. I don't think beyond saying saltwater that there's more that you can be more easily classify where they come from. There are classifications as in where they're processed, because there are people who depend. They found that if you in these countries that processing end up with different amounts of infestation at other levels, and there are. If you look, you'll see there are lists out of which fish have it or don't have these worms. It's not really clear how accurate or reliable those lists are. I know that they sound very authoritative, but it's not so clear. And a number of hashkachas are working together now to try to get more accurate information, to be able to tell you that this, Chilean bass is this as opposed to European or something like that.
But you can definitely come that it's like everywhere, meaning like both Atlantic and Pacific?
It is both, yes.
Okay. And is it more common, like anadromous fish also would have it, right?
I don't know what that means.
Oh, like salmon that go upstream.
The reason, one of the...
Saltwater, it starts saltwater.
Right, so they pick up the worm when they're out in the salt water. They only go back into the fresh water to spawn. So by that point, they've already been infected. They already picked it up. If they grew only in,
Whitefish?
I'm trying to, which water they come from?
Whitefish is a freshwater fish.
Right, Lake Superior, that's what I'm trying to. Lake Superior whitefish, supposedly, does not have it in it. And presumably that's because that's a freshwater fish that doesn't expose itself to the salt water where it would be exposed to the larger fish and the anisakis, etc. Yeah.
Just, you were talking about things are different as far as the worms that we have now and the numbers and the ratios. We're finding with the Asian carp that we're talking about that things are different once there's an infestation, so that becomes the dominant species. Which is it's possible that that's happening with worms too.
It's possible, but you'd have to
I understand. I'm just saying
prove to me
it's not,
that it could be that one.
things like that happen.
Okay.
The practical question of the canned fish, you mentioned that as part of your argument, which one is right or wrong. Is there any segmentation? I mean, in terms of OU or CRC, which says that the canned fish is a problem?
Okay, so let me say this. The good news for some of you is that tuna, for some reason, doesn't have it. Okay, so whoever likes canned tuna or whatever tuna doesn't appear to have it. The salmon, canned salmon, by and large, comes from wild salmon. Excuse me, and therefore does have a problem with these worms in it. The canned salmon does have it. Now, at this meeting last week, where they were showing the fish, they were showing the worms, one of the people involved approached Rabbi Fishbein, and the CRC gives hashgacha on salmon in Alaska, and he wanted to do the following. He wanted to say, I told you that the worms are only found in the belly flap, on one certain part of the flesh. So he said it's like this: let's go to a factory, have them cut the fish, cut the belly flap off, put the belly flap into the non-kosher canned salmon, and make the kosher canned salmon out of the other part of the fish. Okay? From the fisheries perspective, that's okay. They don't care. Fish is fish. But if they would slice it off, and it's an easy way you could slice in between, give the Jews the top of the fish, and give The people don't eat kosher at the bottom of the fish. Okay, just waits till it hits the paper. But give the worms, give to them, and we'll keep the non-worms. But for now, but now until that happens, they talked about that whether that's feasible. But for now, canned salmon is supposedly has it.
Supposedly has it.
Does have
What
it.
you're saying that the OU label or the CRC label on a canned fish, you should bring back to the store and give it back?
No, they think it's mutter.
But it's okay.
They say that they hold the OU holds as a seriously that the worms are mutter. The Shulchan Aruch says that the worms are mutter, so they don't feel so bad. They say the worms are mutter. They're not doing anything to get rid of it. Others who say that the worms are usher wouldn't give hashkacha on canned salmon. It's not possible. It's almost impossible. Okay? Yes.
You said that the Ada is matter. Who are the customer with Ashkakas and Eretz Yisrael that are Asher?
That answer the worms? Okay. The three most prominent people who have written that it's usher are Rabbi Yasher, Rav Azer, and Rav Nissen Karelitz. Have put into writing that they think that the worms are usher.
Sorry, I didn't catch what you said.
Rav Nissen Karelitz, runs a bed in Bnei Brak. Three very prominent persons who have said that the worms are usher. As I mentioned to you, most of the American hashkachas think that it's mutter. Here in America, people who are not, so to speak, affiliated with the hashkachas, Rav Shlomo Gissinger is a person in Lakewood. He's the, if we could say, the Rebbe of most of the people who check vegetables in the United States. That is to say, here in Chicago, the restaurants have people checking vegetables. Okay? Those people have learned from Rabbi Eisenbach. Rabbi Eisenbach takes care of food service for the CRC. So, we go back, if you keep going back generations, most of the Rebbeim go back to Rabbi Gissinger. Rabbi Gissinger is like the head of...
Kind of like the fish chain.
Yes, he's on top of the chain of people teaching about bugs in America. In Eretz Yisrael, that person is Rav Moshe Baya. He's a person actually in the United States right now. Is Rav Moshe Baya. He also holds that it's mutter. And in England, it's somebody Rabbi Falk in Gateshead, and he also holds that the fish are mutter. The worms are mutter. So here we have people who are... Yes. So these are people who are very involved. I have to just put it into perspective. If you look, you'll find on the internet a write-up of one of Rabbi Vaya's recent speeches. He's in America now. He spoke to an audience and told them that they shouldn't eat, if I remember correctly, raisins and corn on the cob. They may have been other things because of bugs. What?
Strawberries.
And strawberries because they have bugs in them. Okay. Well, I'm saying, in the same speech said, but it's okay to eat the worms from the fish. So what I'm saying is that these are people who are not people who are makel about everything. It's really not like that. He wouldn't eat in my house, okay? Because my house is full of bugs according to his view. But yet he looks at the worms and the fish and says, even so, I think that it's mutter. So there's people on both sides. What can I say? That's it.
Do you feel why
Strawberries, raisin, what was the third?
Corn on the cob.
the bug experts in the world are saying it's okay, so where's Rabbi Yasher and doesn't tell us, and plus we're really getting information from it.
Their information comes from a group of sources, in particular one person who's promoting the fact that the fish should be awesome. So,
You feel that they're giving wrong information?
I didn't say that.
I'm asking.
They've heard both sides of the story. I have no way of knowing whether they're being given a fair hearing of it. I have reason to believe that they are hearing both sides fairly. There are specific halachic issues that we know that poskim disagree about, and there may be other things that we don't know about. The only one who's written the tshuva was Rav Azer. The other ones have not written anything. They wrote, I hold that it's usher. That shows what he holds. That doesn't explain what he holds. But the only one who's written anything more lengthy is Rav Azer, who's written two tshuvas about it, to why he thinks that it's usher.
Well, I think we should thank Rabbi Cohen. If anybody would like to ask any more questions, you're welcome to gather on the table. And it should be only when it's local around the